Imagine a mother in Italy in the year 1400. She has just given birth, but the baby is sickly. The priest is summoned, but he arrives too late. The infant dies before the water of baptism can touch its forehead. For that mother, this is not just a tragedy of loss. It is a tragedy of eternity. She knows the teaching of the Church. She knows that every human being is born with the stain of original sin, inherited from Adam. She knows that the only way to wash away that stain and open the gates of heaven is through the sacrament of baptism. So, she asks the terrifying question, "Where is my baby now?" The Church had a specific answer for her. It wasn't hell. Her baby hadn't committed any personal sins to deserve fire. But it wasn't heaven either without baptism. The soul was technically unqualified to see the face of God. Instead, her child was in a third place. A permanent borderland. A state of natural happiness, but eternal separation from the divine. It was called the limbus infantium, the limbo of infants. For nearly 800 years, limbo was a fixed feature on the Catholic map of the afterlife. It was discussed by saints, painted by artists, and preached from pulpits. It shaped the grief of millions of parents. But if you walk into a Catholic church today and ask a priest about limbo, you will likely hear a very different answer. You might hear that it was never official doctrine. You might hear that we now hope those babies are in heaven. In 2007, the Vatican effectively signed the death certificate for limbo. Pope Benedict XVI approved a document that relegated this centuries-old concept to the theological history books. How does an entire realm of the afterlife just disappear? How did the Church move from being certain that unbaptized babies could not enter heaven, to hoping that they do? Today, we are exploring the rise and fall of the afterlife's most confusing neighborhood. We are going to trace the history of the edge, to answer the question, what happened to limbo? To understand why limbo was invented, we first have to understand the brutal theological problem it was trying to solve. That problem is original sin. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the great theologian Saint Augustine of Hippo engaged in a fierce debate with a monk named Pelagius. Pelagius argued that humans are born neutral. We only become sinners when we choose to sin. Therefore, an infant who dies is innocent and goes straight to heaven. Augustine argued that this was heresy. He cited the Apostle Paul, Romans 5:2, argue that all humans sinned in Adam. We are born broken. We are born guilty. We are a mass of perdition. Augustine won the debate. Original sin became the official doctrine of Western Christianity. But this created a horrific logical conclusion. If everyone is born guilty, and baptism is the only cure, then unbaptized babies die in a state of guilt. Augustine, known for his unflinching logic, bit the bullet. He taught that unbaptized infants do go to hell. However, Augustine wasn't a monster. He argued that because they had committed no personal sin, their punishment would be the mildest condemnation, mitissima damnatio. They wouldn't suffer the raging fires of the wicked. They would just suffer a mild discomfort or a separation from God. For centuries, this was the dark reality. Grieving parents were told their unbaptized children were technically in hell, just the easy part of it. But as the Middle Ages dawned, theologians began to feel that even the mildest punishment was too harsh for an innocent child. They needed a loophole. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the great scholastic theologians, men like Peter Lombard and Thomas Aquinas, decided to re-engineer the afterlife. They looked at the geography of hell and decided to zone it. They proposed a new section located on the very edge or hem of the underworld. In Latin, the word for hem or border is limbus. Thus, limbo was born. Aquinas brilliantly solved the Augustine problem by distinguishing between two types of punishment. 1. The pain of sense. This is the fire, the torture, the physical agony of hell. This is for personal sin. 2. The pain of loss. Pona damni. This is the spiritual sadness of knowing you will never see God, the beatific vision. This is for original sin. Aquinas argued that unbaptized babies, having no personal sin, suffer zero pain of sense, no fire, no torture. But, Because they lack baptism, they still suffer the pain of loss. They cannot enter heaven. However, Aquinas added a twist of mercy. He argued that because these infants don't have the intelligence to know what they are missing, they don't actually feel sad about it. So, what is their experience? Theologians described limbo as a state of perfect natural happiness. Imagine a perpetual, pleasant Sunday afternoon in a beautiful garden. You are happy, you are playing, you are content. You just aren't with God. You are eternally fine, but not eternally saved. This solution was a hit. It satisfied the theological requirement: original sin is punished by exclusion from heaven, while satisfying the moral intuition. Dante Alighieri canonized this image in his Divine Comedy. In his Inferno, the first circle of hell is limbo. It isn't a place of screaming, it's a place of sighs. It is a noble castle where unbaptized babies dwell alongside the virtuous pagans like Plato and Virgil. For 800 years, this was the standard Catholic answer. It wasn't an official dogma, a truth revealed by God, but it was a standard theological hypothesis taught by almost every priest. So, if limbo was such a perfect solution, why did the Church get rid of it? The collapse of limbo began in the 20th century, driven by three massive shifts. 1. The liturgical shift comforting the parents. In the past, the funeral rite for an unbaptized baby was stark. The priest couldn't wear white, the church bells couldn't be rung, the child couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. It was a ritual of exclusion. But pastoral reality clashed with theology. Priests, seeing the devastation of parents, wanted to offer hope, not just natural happiness. They wanted to say, your child is with Jesus. 2. The theological shift, God's universal will to save. Modern theologians began to emphasize 1 Timothy 2-4. God desires all men to be saved. They asked a hard question: if God wants everyone to be saved, and if a baby cannot choose baptism for themselves, would a loving God really let a bureaucratic technicality thwart his infinite love? They began to argue that God is not bound by his sacraments. While baptism is the normal way to save, God can save people outside the system if he wants to. 3. The modern sensibility. In a post-Holocaust, post-war world, the idea of God excluding innocence became increasingly intolerable. The legalistic God of the Middle Ages was being replaced by a relational God, limbo. Started to feel less like a mercy and more like a cruel, arbitrary detention center. By the time Pope John Paul II, and later Pope Benedict XVI, who was a top theologian, came to power, limbo was already a ghost town. Almost no one taught it anymore. It was time to make it official. In 2007, the International Theological Commission, ITC, approved by Pope Benedict XVI, released a landmark document titled, The Hope of Salvation for Infants Who Die Without Being Baptized. The media headlines screamed Popey Abolicis Limbo. But if you read the document, it's more subtle than that. The Church didn't say, limbo definitely doesn't exist. Instead, they said, limbo reflects an unduly restrictive view of salvation. They argued that there are strong theological reasons to hope that God saves these infants and admits them fully into heaven. They pointed to the innocence of the children. They pointed to God's mercy. They pointed to the solidarity of Christ. With the conclusion was careful but revolutionary. Little ones. The conclusion was careful but revolutionary. We have prayerful hope rather than knowledge that infants who die without baptism may be saved and brought into eternal happiness. They traded certainty, limbo, for hope, heaven. This was a massive relief for millions of grieving parents. But it also created a new theological tension. The death of limbo solved the problem of cruelty, but it created a problem of necessity. This brings us to the final debate. On one side, the modern merciful view. This view celebrates the death of limbo as a triumph of love over logic. It argues that we finally have a theology that matches the character of Jesus, who said, "Let the children come to me." It relieves the unnecessary guilt of parents' miscarriages, stillbirths, and affirms that God's grace is bigger than our rituals. On the other side, the traditionalist logic view. However, traditionalists ask a difficult question. If babies go to heaven without baptism, then why do we baptize? If original sin doesn't block entry to heaven, is original sin real? If you can get to heaven without the sacrament, is the sacrament necessary? Some argue that by closing limbo, the Church accidentally undermined the urgency of baptism. If everyone gets in for free, why join the Church? Did the Church fix a mistake? Or did they break the theological engine to make us feel better? Is limbo a relic of a cruel past, or a necessary piece of the logic of salvation? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this theological evolution in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the changing geography of the afterlife fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content that uncovers the real stories behind our beliefs. Thanks for watching.